Two children walk into the forest with their father, only he walks out. This wasn't murder, it was survival. And it happened thousands of times across medieval Europe during 7 years that historians call the Great Dying. The story of Hansel and Gretel, that you know? That's the cleaned up version. The Brothers Grimm took a nightmare that actually happened and turned it into something parents could read to children without screaming. But the original events, the real history behind those breadcrumbs, that candy house, and yes, even that oven, are far more disturbing than any fairy tale. Welcome back, and if you're new here, make sure to subscribe and tell us in the comments what dark historical topic you want us to cover next. What if the witch wasn't a witch at all? What if she was just someone who learned to survive when everything else had failed? And what if the real monsters in this story were the people we're supposed to sympathize with? There's a reason medieval European forests were so feared, and it had nothing to do with wolves or bandits. Between 1315 and 1322, these forests became something far more sinister. They became Europe's hidden cemeteries for unwanted children. And the worst part? Everyone knew it was happening. Medieval town records reveal something chilling. Communities actually created unspoken agreements about child abandonment. There were no official documents, no laws explicitly permitting it, but there were patterns. Certain forest trails became known routes. Certain clearings became understood destinations. Families would take their children on these paths, and neighbors would simply look the other way. Church officials documented what they called the season of empty cradles. Every spring, when winter food stores ran lowest, parishes would see a spike in families reporting children as lost in the woods or taken by fever. But the priests knew better. They recorded these deaths, blessed the absent bodies, and said nothing. Because speaking the truth meant acknowledging that their entire community had become complicit in something unforgivable. The father in Hansel and Gretel represents every medieval parent who participated in this system. He's not portrayed as evil. He's shown as weak, conflicted, someone who goes along with a terrible decision because refusing would mean his entire family starves. Historical letters from the period show this exact internal struggle. Fathers writing to priests, seeking absolution for choices they hadn't even made yet. What makes this particularly devastating is how normalized it became. Town councils began unofficially designating certain forest areas as appropriate for family difficulties. They didn't say abandonment, they used euphemisms. Taking children to God's care was a common phrase. Leaving them to Providence was another. The language itself became a conspiracy of silence. Medieval legal records show that authorities prosecuted almost no cases of child abandonment during the Great Famine. Despite clear evidence, it was epidemic. Why? Because prosecuting these cases would require acknowledging the scale of what was happening. It would mean admitting that entire generations of parents had chosen to kill their children rather than watch them starve slowly at home. The forest wasn't just a setting, it was a solution. And that solution was adopted across Europe with terrifying efficiency. Medieval families didn't make these decisions impulsively. They calculated. Household ledgers from the period reveal a brutal arithmetic that would make modern people physically ill. Parents would literally chart calories consumed versus work produced, treating their children like livestock being evaluated for slaughter. A typical calculation looked like this. A child under 5 consumed approximately 800 calories daily, but produced 0 economic value. A working adult needed 2,000 calories but could farm, hunt, or generate income. During famine conditions, when daily food availability dropped below family requirements, the math became simple and horrifying. Remove the consumers who don't produce. But the calculations went deeper. Medieval documents show parents factoring in which children had the best survival prospects outside the family. Older children who might make it alone were kept. Middle children with no special skills were abandoned first. Youngest children, still nursing, were sometimes kept because they required minimal resources. The cruelty wasn't random, it was systematic. What's particularly disturbing is evidence that communities shared these calculation methods. Town meetings during 1316-1317 included discussions about family optimization strategies. While records use careful language, the meaning is clear. They were teaching each other how to decide which children to abandon. This wasn't just individual families making isolated, terrible choices. It was coordinated survival planning at the community level. The Hansel and Gretel story captures another documented reality: children's awareness of their parents' calculations. Historical accounts describe kids as young as 4 or 5, understanding that they were being evaluated for abandonment. Some children began hiding food, trying to appear stronger and more useful. Others ran away before their parents could abandon them, choosing uncertainty over the betrayal they saw coming. Medieval psychological texts from shortly after the famine describe what we'd now call generational trauma. Entire populations of survivors grew up knowing their parents had considered killing them. The trust between generations shattered in ways that took centuries to heal. Some historians argue this trauma fundamentally changed European family structures, making them more transactional and less emotionally bonded. The breadcrumbs in the story represent children desperately trying to maintain connection with parents who had already severed that bond in their hearts. Modern archaeology has confirmed the darkest suspicions about medieval child abandonment. Forest excavations across former Holy Roman Empire territories consistently reveal the same pattern: concentrated child remains in specific clearings dating precisely to the Great Famine period. What's most disturbing isn't the number of bodies, though that's horrific enough. It's the age distribution. Skeletal analysis shows the abandoned children cluster between ages 3 and 7. Not infants, who died quickly from exposure. Not older children who had survival value. This specific age range represents cold calculation: old enough to survive without constant care, young enough to lack economic value. The bone evidence tells stories that historical documents tried to hide. Some skeletons show signs of being dressed in multiple layers, parents trying to give their children a fighting chance even as they abandoned them. Others show evidence of small amounts of food in their stomach contents, a final meal before being led into the forest. These weren't spontaneous abandonments. They were planned operations carried out with terrible deliberation. Forest archaeology has also revealed another disturbing pattern: evidence of children living temporarily in makeshift camps before death. Excavations show primitive shelters, fire pits, and caches of gathered foods. The children in Hansel and Gretel who build a new life in the forest aren't fictional. They were based on real kids who tried desperately to survive their parents' betrayal. Some sites show evidence of multiple occupation periods, suggesting certain forest locations became known refuges for abandoned children. Historical hints suggest these child communities occasionally formed, with older survivors helping newer arrivals. But these groups rarely lasted more than a season. Starvation, exposure, and disease killed them all eventually. The most haunting archaeological discoveries are the small personal items found with the remains. Wooden toys, small pieces of fabric, items clearly cherished by children who carried them into the forest as their final possessions. These objects represent the last connections between abandoned children and the families that betrayed them. When the Brothers Grimm collected the Hansel and Gretel story, they were preserving evidence of a genocide that Europe wanted to forget. The forest wasn't a fairy tale setting. It was a crime scene. The gingerbread house wasn't built by magic. It was built by understanding. Whoever created that trap knew exactly what starving children needed most, and used that knowledge as a weapon. Medieval criminal records from the famine years describe this exact predatory strategy, and it's more disturbing than any fairy tale could capture. During the Great Famine, a new type of criminal emerged, what period documents called child hunters. These weren't supernatural beings. They were ordinary people who made a calculated decision that, once crossed, transformed them into something medieval society had no framework to understand. They specifically targeted the thousands of children abandoned in forests, knowing these kids were already invisible to society. The psychology was brutally simple. Abandoned children were desperate, traumatized, and conditioned to distrust adults who might be their parents returning to finish what they started. But hunger overrides fear every time. Display enough food, and even the most suspicious child will eventually approach. The gingerbread house represents this predatory understanding, a trap designed by someone who'd studied their prey. What makes this more disturbing is evidence that some of these predators were formerly respectable community members. Court records describe a merchant, a former nun, and even a town official prosecuted for crimes involving the hunting and consumption of children. These weren't society's outcasts. They were people who'd held positions of trust before hunger rewired their moral framework entirely. Medieval legal testimonies reveal predators developing sophisticated lures. They would leave trails of actual food leading to their dwellings. They would position themselves near known abandonment sites. Some even mimicked the calls or songs of children to attract others. The fairy tales, singing birds, and sweet-calling witch weren't fantastical elements. They were based on documented predatory techniques. The most chilling aspect is how quickly some individuals adapted to this new reality. Court documents describe cases where predators moved from their first kill to systematic hunting within weeks. The psychological threshold once crossed seemed to eliminate further moral resistance. They didn't just become cannibals, they became efficient at it. The witch in Hansel and Gretel wasn't born a monster. The famine created her, one terrible choice at a time. Archaeological evidence from the famine period reveals something that historians initially refused to believe. Some cannibalistic operations were sophisticated enough to suggest planning and infrastructure. Excavated cellars from this era show modifications that served no purpose for normal food storage, but were perfectly designed for darker activities. These sites contained specialized tools, cutting implements designed for processing larger mammals, drainage systems that would be unnecessary for animal butchery, and preservation equipment indicating long-term operations rather than desperate one-time acts. The witch's organized oven, her cage for Hansel, her systematic fattening strategy, these weren't fairy tale inventions. They reflected documented reality. Medieval court records describe raids on suspected cannibal operations that revealed disturbing levels of organization. One case from 1318 described a location with multiple holding areas, each containing children in various stages of preparation. Another documented a preservation system using salt and smoke that indicated the operator had developed expertise specifically for human meat. What's particularly horrifying is evidence suggesting some communities knew about these operations but tolerated them as long as they targeted only abandoned children. Several legal cases were dismissed or received surprisingly lenient sentences, with court documents noting that the victims were already forsaken or had no family to speak for them. Society had created a category of children whose lives had so little value that their systematic murder barely registered as criminal. The fairy tale's emphasis on the witch testing Hansel's finger to check if he's fattened enough reflects documented cannibal methodology. Legal testimonies describe predators developing evaluation techniques, understanding optimal body conditions for different age groups, and even experimenting with feeding regimens to improve meat quality. This wasn't desperate survival. It had become specialized knowledge. Some archaeological sites show evidence of multiple victims processed over extended periods, suggesting these operations could last months or even years before discovery. The witch who'd been eating children for so long that she'd lost count was an exaggeration. She represented individuals who'd transformed cannibalism from crisis response to sustainable practice. The oven becomes even more sinister when you understand it wasn't just for cooking. Medieval preservation techniques required sustained heat for smoking and drying meat. The witch's oven was industrial equipment for processing human beings into stored nutrition. Gretel pushing the witch into the oven represents something that actually happened multiple times during the famine years. Children successfully defending themselves against adult predators and winning. Medieval legal records contain several cases of justified homicide by minors, and the details are remarkably similar to the fairy tale's climax. In 1319, a case in Bavaria described two siblings who killed an adult woman attempting to lure them into her home. The children testified that they'd observed her hunting behavior, recognized the danger, and planned their defense. The court not only acquitted them, but documented their testimony as a warning to others about predatory patterns. This case circulated widely enough to potentially influence oral traditions that later became fairy tales. What's significant is how these defensive killings changed medieval attitudes toward abandoned children. Prior to the famine, these kids were seen as helpless victims, but documented cases of children successfully defending themselves, forming protective groups, and even hunting their hunters transformed them into something else. survivors capable of violence when necessary. Archaeological evidence supports this shift. Forest sites associated with child abandonment occasionally contain adult remains showing signs of violent death, with bone damage consistent with defensive attacks by smaller, weaker individuals using improvised weapons. These weren't random deaths. They appear to be coordinated defensive actions by groups of children protecting themselves or each other. The fairy tale's ending, where Hansel and Gretel return home with the witch's wealth, reflects documented cases where surviving children would emerge from forests carrying items taken from the homes of predators they'd killed. Medieval courts generally treated these takings as justified compensation rather than theft. Some communities even celebrated these children as heroes, though that celebration came with uncomfortable questions about why they'd been abandoned in the first place. What Hansel and Gretel really represents is this: a story where children rejected their assigned role as victims. They survived adult betrayal, recognized adult predation, and fought back with intelligence and determination. In an era when children were considered property with no agency, this narrative was revolutionary. The witch's death in her own oven wasn't just poetic justice. It was wish fulfillment for a generation of children who'd learned that adults couldn't be trusted to protect them. The Brothers Grimm weren't storytellers. They were historians who understood that some truths are too terrible to speak plainly. Hansel and Gretel isn't a warning about strangers or a lesson about obedience. It's a memorial to thousands of children who died in European forests because their parents chose survival over love. Everything we've explored today, the systematic abandonment, the predatory cannibalism, the children who fought back, all of it happened. The archaeological evidence is undeniable. The legal records are explicit. The forest graves speak for themselves. What began as individual acts of desperation during the Great Famine of 1315-1322 evolved into something far darker: a coordinated system for disposing of society's most vulnerable members. But here's what makes this story genuinely important. It reveals how quickly civilization can collapse when resources disappear. Medieval Europeans weren't inherently more evil than we are. They were normal people facing impossible circumstances, and they made choices that would haunt their descendants for centuries. The fairy tale survived because it captured a truth about human nature that we still need to remember: that anyone, under sufficient pressure, is capable of unthinkable acts. The witch, the parents, even the children themselves, they're all reflections of what desperation creates. The real horror isn't that monsters exist, it's that ordinary people become monsters when survival demands it. And the gingerbread house? That beautiful trap built from the very thing starving children needed most? That's perhaps the darkest truth of all. Predators understand their victims better than protectors do. The next time someone tells you Hansel and Gretel, remember you're not hearing a children's story. You're hearing a confession that took 500 years to tell. The stories we dismiss as fairy tales often contain the darkest chapters of human history. They're not just entertainment. They're coded testimony from people who lived through nightmares and needed to pass warnings to future generations without being too explicit about the horrors they witnessed. If this investigation into the real history behind Hansel and Gretel changed how you see fairy tales forever, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss our next deep exploration into the dark truths hidden in plain sight. Now here's what I want from you. Comment below with the fairy tale you think has the darkest real-world origin story. Little Mermaid? Snow White? Rapunzel? Your suggestions literally determine what we investigate next, and believe me, once you start seeing these stories as historical documents instead of fiction, you'll never be able to unhear the screams they're trying to hide. Which childhood story should we expose next? Drop your answer in the comments, and remember, the versions they told you were the sanitized ones. The truth is always worse than the tale.